Hey everyone, and welcome to another Konoha Reviews, where we review both old and new games on all platforms. If you like these reviews, then please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a review on here. Today we take a look at the almost 20 years old classic Nintendo 64 game Conker's Bad Fur Day. Now to some, this game might seem like it comes out of left field and seems a bit random. But you might be surprised to find out that this game is on my top 10 favorite games of all time. In fact, I think it's the first game of my top 10 favorite games of all time that I'll be reviewing on my channel. It's not my favorite game of all time, if that's what you're wondering, but I think that the tone has already been set by mentioning this at the beginning of the review. The game was a critical success, but a financial failure. Yet in due time has gathered a cult following who love it and hope that someday we will see a proper sequel. So without further ado, let's take a deep dive into this one-of-a-kind masterpiece. So Conker's Bad Fur Day was developed by Rareware, when Rare had still the status of a legendary company. Classics like GoldenEye, Banjo-Kazooie, Donkey Kong 64, and the underrated Jet Force Gemini made it to an absolute powerhouse. Now from what I understand, a part of the creators had already left Rare by this time or worked on other projects, and Conker's Bad Fur Day was made by a very small team, but it actually feels like a very ambitious project. In the previous years, Rare had made some adult games like GoldenEye, but most of their games were family friendly, with Diddy Kong Racing being the most kid friendly, but also games like Banjo-Kazooie and Donkey Kong providing fun for the whole family with some snarky remarks and humor that could be appreciated by adults only. Yet it never crossed a line of going too far. But with Conker's Bad Fur Day, the creators wanted to do something very different. Conker's Bad Fur Day would be an 18+ mature audience only platformer that starred cute and cuddly characters like seen in other platformers, but this time, there would be a whole lot of cursing, alcohol, violence, gore, and plenty of toilet humor. I remember seeing screenshots and reading about the game in anticipation, so I knew from the beginning what I would be getting into. Though the amount of insanity, gore, and poo jokes I was not prepared for. But I bought this game when I was 10, and it's actually, I think, the very first M-rated or 18+ game that I ever owned. Nowadays, we have multiple franchises that combine cutesy characters or animation styles with horrific gore and violence, but back in those days, this was still quite new. Since it was all so cartoony, I do also believe that this game can indeed be appreciated by a younger audience sooner than a more realistic depiction of, let's say, Mortal Kombat. Since the game came out in 2001, it was kind of the swan song of the Nintendo 64, since the GameCube would release later that same year and the following year in Europe. But because of that, it showcases the full graphical potential of the Nintendo 64, also because it uses the expansion pack. But in terms of graphics, there might not be a single Nintendo 64 game that looks prettier than Conker's Bad Fur Day. The characters all look colorful and vibrant, with great draw distance and beautiful details like proper reflections and even dynamic shadows push the Nintendo 64 to its limits. Sure, the graphics definitely feel dated by today's standards, but in my opinion, hold up so much better since they are so cartoony and colorful. There was a remake for the Xbox a few years later, and though that version is also worth playing, I do prefer the original due to how colorful and vibrant it is. There's just something about the fullness of the Nintendo 64 graphics that makes my nostalgia heart tick. It's something that, for example, the PlayStation 1 does not have for me, and indeed showcases that Nintendo 64 was the more powerful system. The game also has plenty of cutscenes that are hilarious and incredible to watch, and all are fully voice acted. The quality of the audio dialogue is a bit distorted sometimes, but there's such a sheer amount of dialogue that is written so incredibly well that you can easily look past that. On this note, it is actually something that the Xbox version improves upon greatly. Audio is much more crisp in that version. What is also incredible is that I found out that the voice acting in this game has basically been done by only 2 people. One guy doing all the voices for all the male characters, and one woman doing the voice for all the female characters. But they do an amazing job of doing so many different kinds of voices and accents that you wouldn't notice with a few exceptions of similar sounding character types. It sounds maybe like a bad thing where there's only 2 voice actors, but in this case, their performance is so good that it definitely is not. So what about the story of Conker's Bad Fur Day? Well, the story is absolutely insane, and one of the reasons why this game is so good. So the game all takes place during one single day, in which Conker goes from drinking with some mates in a bar to becoming king of all the land. Yep, that's one heck of a change. How this came to be is that Conker went out drinking and got really drunk, and on the way home he got lost and now needs to find his way home, which is easier said than done. Along his journey, he will come across a whole bunch of colorful characters that often want Conker to do something for them in exchange for a reward like hard-earned cash. Some of the characters you come across are a farting, alcoholic scarecrow, a posh catfish, a cat-hating tiny grim reaper named Greg, a vampire squirrel with a scrotum hairdo, a homeless bee who wants to pollinate a big-breasted sunflower, or a pitchfork that tries to commit suicide but cannot since he has no neck. Yeah, it's really out there, and the humor of the game is very harsh, offensive, and shocking. Honestly, some of these jokes would result in a few articles being written by sensitive journalists nowadays if we saw it in a modern game release. But I think that all jokes in this game are just perfect satire and never get to be offensive to the point where they cross a line. But they definitely do cross a line with its humor and shock value compared to other games, but not that line. What's interesting too is that in many platforming games you also have a bunch of colorful characters that you will run into each level or stage, but with Conker's Bad Fur Day that is not the case. Rather than stages, the game actually moves quite linear, with always a clear destination to head towards, and instead you will run into many characters only once or twice, and that's the end of that. It was really surprising to me at first, since they built up some of the characters in the magazines beforehand, but for many, to most, you will only meet and interact with them in one single section. But this does result in something absolutely genius, and that is the variation in situations and characters you run into, and this is where Conker's Bad Fur Day shines. By now, you know that one of the things I value most in games is variety, whether it's in the gameplay or levels, and this game delivers on both of them. To demonstrate this, I will talk a bit about the flow of the game and some things that you can expect to do and see. So the game begins with Conker feeling miserable, and you're talking to a scarecrow that teaches you about context-sensitive platforms. Throughout the game, you will see various areas that have the letter B written on top of them, and whenever you stand on there and press B, something will happen depending on the situation. It can be something simple as pulling an aspirin from your pocket to get rid of your headache, to grabbing a giant toilet paper roll to defeat a giant singing poo, or turning into an anvil to lower a platform or bridge. After you are done with the tutorial by the scarecrow, you get blocked by a stone gargoyle who refuses to move, but you then punch out the bridge to his death with a frying pan. After that, you meet a queen bee whose husband has run off with a sunflower and have to get her beehive back from evil wasps. Once you have done this, the queen bee heads into the beehive that then reveals to have machine guns attached to them and kills the wasps as they explode violently. Not too long after, you run into dung beetles who want to kick the crap out of you, and you can defeat them with a slingshot, after which you need to kill a farting and burping mouse by feeding it living cheese, which cries and begs you not to feed it to the mouse. This mouse section is the first where Conker uses the rule of 3, and this is something that it abides to a lot. The rule of 3 actually counts to a lot of Nintendo games, but it basically comes down to that you have to do a certain action or gameplay aspect 3 times over before it's done. The mouse, for example, wants you to feed him 3 cheeses before the quest is completed. Later on, you need to kill 3 cows that all have horrible diarrhea, or you have to find 3 missing keys in a zombie-filled mansion. Often the things you need to do don't necessarily involve platforming, and therefore, I can also see why one would describe Conker's Bad Fur Day as an action-adventure rather than a platformer only. With the cheese mission, for example, it's impossible for Conker to jump once he's holding a piece of cheese, and you need to carefully time your walks as you head underneath giant jumping boxes. After you are done with defeating the mouse, he explodes and bursts into many tiny bloody bits before letting out one final fart. And this is all just in the first hour, and by that time, you have seen these cute critters curse, vomit, fart, murder, and die horrible deaths. The stage is definitely set with how insane this story and game is, but it gets only crazier and crazier the further you play. At the same time, it also has an insane and very funny background story, with an evil Panther King who has the issue of drinking a glass of milk and setting it on a table with only 3 legs. The balance is off and the glass falls and breaks. Instead of fixing the table or replacing it, he hires the help of a German-sounding cursing professor, who comes to the conclusion that the only way to fix the issue of the table missing a leg is to replace the leg with a red squirrel, as a red squirrel fits the exact size. Oh yeah, it's nonsense, but very funny and entertaining. A bit later, you are tasked with clearing a barn of live hay bales by having a living pitchfork aim for you, but dodging out of the way just in time. As a result, the hay will be killed and explodes with their eyeballs hitting the floor and exploding into goo when Conker walks over it. Then thereafter, you have a boss fight against a giant monster of hay that then is revealed to be a robot in the style of Terminator, even with an Arnold accent. And this is also where many of the pop culture references come in. Conker's Bad Fur Day is just chock full of pop culture reference, both in the cutscenes, but also gameplay. References to Terminator, Jaws, Godfather, and The Untouchables, Saving Private Ryan, The Exorcist, Dracula, and even The Matrix and Alien all get the foreground at one point in the game. It was as if the creators just did not give a damn, and I think that's just what was the case, exactly. The story and setting is so crazy that anything goes, so if they thought it would be cool to put this in the game, they just did it, and I love them for it. So after dealing with the Terminator boss, you help a homeless bee to pollinate a big-breasted sunflower by collecting ticklish bees to reveal her giant rack. A very funny cutscene follows, after which she invites Conker to bounce on her big boobs to collect some cash, and yep, this game is absolutely insane and does not give a damn. After that, you head towards Pooh Mountain, and have just a whole bunch of fart and poo jokes. Everything that has to do with poo, you do. The song in the background even consists at some point only of poo and fart noises. Your first task is to get cows to drink some prune juice so that they will get diarrhea, so that dung beetles will roll a ball of poo for you. You then have to kill each of the cows by riding a bull who hates the color red, after which the bull then falls into the giant hole of diarrhea of the cows and freaking dies by drowning in poo. I mean, by this time you are really wondering what in God's name is this game? Many, if not most of the characters you will come across in the game will suffer horrible deaths in the end, and many are pretty hilarious at that. The creators went all out on their way too, to let you know that yes, they are indeed dead, as later on you swim through the poo, you see the poor bull float there in all its glory. Anyway, after that you finally get your craved ball of poo, and you need to roll up a hill to get rid of some pesky dung beetles, and eventually create an opening to the next boss. I said earlier that the game is pretty linear, and this is indeed the case for most of it, but there are sometimes a few areas you can go into whichever order you want. You can, for example, go to the next boss, which has yet to do with poo, or go towards a vault that is guarded by a bulldog-looking shark to retrieve cash for these snobby catfishes. This area has some really memorable and outright ridiculous sections too, with you having to face against these weird flaming demons that are drinking booze and smoking joints. When I see Conker, one of them actually literally sticks the joint they were just smoking up his own ass. You defeat these guys by drinking lots of alcohol and then peeing on them to extinguish them. I mean, by this time you would also think that maybe some of the creators have a fetish, but I myself just laughed my ass off so hard for how ridiculous this all was. Again, it's offensive and toilet humor to the max, and I think it's super funny. But the fight gets even more insane as the demons then head into a giant boiler with legs, and at the bottom, some testicles. Yep, some big brass balls. And the way you defeat this guy is by getting him drunk and then squishing his balls with 2 large bricks. Ouch! It's all absolutely insane and unlike any other game you have played. Well, maybe South Park is something that is similar, but for that time, there was nothing like it. This section also then ends up with the bulldog ripping itself loose from its rope and eating the catfish in a horrible and bloody fashion. After you are done here, you have the confrontation with probably the most famous boss in the entire game, which is called the Great Mighty Pooh. This is a giant pile of poo with eyes and sweet corn for teeth, and the funny thing about it is that it's a very well-mannered opera singer. His song is even accompanied by lyrics at the bottom and a timer in the form of a ball of poo for whoever wants to sing along. I'm not kidding in that I've completed this game so much that I could sing this song blindly for many years when I was a kid. It's funny, childish, and has no shame, and it fits perfect. You defeat the boss by throwing toilet paper in its mouth whenever it sings, and after this is done, you head on over to the prehistoric world, where you get into all kinds of weird shenanigans again. You need to guide a baby dinosaur through a narrow path as it brutally eats cavemen alive, and then sacrifice the baby by flattening it brutally as a sacrificial area. Then you head into a nightclub and free your girlfriend by peeing on some of the guests, and end up with you having to transport a bomb before it goes off through the entire level without anyone hitting you. Again, every new moment you are doing something new, encountering new insane characters and coming into situations even crazier than the ones before. You then also partake in a race after some hoodlums who stole your cash, and end up in a gladiator battle where cavemen are stacked up against a giant raptor, which you then hypnotize and take over to eat all of the other cavemen in a gruesome fashion. This eventually gets the attention of the so-called big-boned cavehead man, who fights you, only to have you bite him in the nuts to have his garp fall down so you can bite him in the ass, which lifts 3 nasty bloody chunks out of it. Only then to reveal he is not so big-boned, putting him to shame and giving you access to the next area. After that, you head to a haunted mansion after having dealt with some zombies with a shotgun gifted from the very funny Greg the Grim Reaper, and are turned into a vampire bat as you need to search for sacrifices to kill in a grinder to feed a giant vampire bat until it's so heavy that he himself falls into the grinder. And once that is done, you head towards a war front where you storm the beaches in a D-Day style gore fest, only to confront funny sounding teddy bears that very much resemble German soldiers from World War II, but in a very cheeky and funny way. In these levels, you get 2 machine guns and it turns into more of a shooter, and even into a tank level where you need to drive around and shoot at various targets. It ends with a boss fight with a giant robot that first pretends to be a possessed little girl, a la The Exorcist, and once that is done, you head towards the final section where you and your girlfriend take part in this awesome Matrix style level where you jump around from left to right in slow motion as you target the guards to take them out. Then you have the final fight with an actual xenomorph named Heinrich that bursts out of the chest of the Panther King and eventually defeated, while your girlfriend Barry gets shot right before that, leaving Conker to be the king of all the land and the richest creature, but in the end, not happy as he just wanted to go home with his girlfriend and have a beer. For a game that has so much gross humor and profanity, the message at the end was surprisingly heartfelt, and I think it's important to note that it's not only offensive stuff, and that Conker's Bad Fur Day does hit on some right notes and important messages as well, without it feeling forced or too much like a shtick. But gameplay is where it shines as well. Just every 10 minutes or so, you are doing something drastically different from what you were doing before, and I cannot emphasize enough just how great that is. Due to the context-sensitive B sections, you always get different weapons or a different type of gameplay served to you, which just makes it to where the game never feels old or too repetitive. Is all of it excellent? No. Replaying it, I found 2 parts to be a bit annoying. One was diving through a section with robotic eyeball fish, which was a bit difficult to find my bearings, and the part in the nightclub where you had to pee on the guests was also a bit difficult, but nowhere near the point that it lessened the experience. The nightclub, for example, has some amazing sounding music, and just the music in general is absolutely brilliant and has you head shake and your fingers snap to all the fun tunes. The music always fits the environment and also adheres to the variety, as the Haunted Mansion has a far more gothic feel to it, and the war level has a proper military trumpet setting. Platformers often deliver on a lot of variety and different gameplay offerings, with for example Mario Odyssey. But one can also see, like with Mario Sunshine or other lesser known platformers, that they can be pretty repetitive as well, with their gameplay being the same in many different stages. But with Conker, there's always something different and you never know where the story and gameplay will take you next. The game also has excellent multiplayer for split screen fun, or just by yourself against with bots. There's a great variety of multiplayer types, including races, tank battles, capture the flag type scenarios where you, as a caveman, need to retrieve an egg from a bloodthirsty raptor, and your classic team deathmatch in a war setting. Many of these can be played with a lot of bots, and the bots are fun and active. The team deathmatch can even be played with up to 11 bots, making it a 6 vs 6 match, which was huge and pretty epic for the Nintendo 64. The capture the egg mode was also super fun, as you felt a bit scared as a caveman if a raptor had you in its sight, or you felt ultra powerful if you were the one playing as the raptor. This game just has it all. It's an absolute joy to discover, and it's still fun and holds up revisiting again and again. I could see that the final 1/3 of the game might feel a bit rushed, since the story then really doesn't make any sense anymore, and it just feels like going from pop culture reference to pop culture reference, but the quality of the writing, the jokes, and the gameplay is still so good and solid that it doesn't hurt the game. I love this journey from beginning to end, and it's a pretty decent length as well, with the game taking anywhere from 7 to 8 hours on your first playthrough. There's a few sections where if you die you have to do a lot over again, which is annoying, but that would be the only critique I have of the game, and these sections are few and far between. Overall, I cannot recommend Conker's Bad Fur Day enough to people who enjoy single player or story-driven games in general. This game has something for everyone and deserves to be experienced. It's a timeless classic that I have completed probably more than 10 times in total and will do so many more times to come in the future. I started and completed this game on the same day for this review, which just shows how much it grabs you and keeps you involved. Conker's Bad Fur Day gets a 9.4. It's an awesome game, and a testament of how good games were already back then. How people dared to take chances, and how the landscape today has changed with people being much more careful or sensitive. For those who are ready to jump into a violent, poo and alcohol-filled adventure that will stick with you, one cannot go wrong with this furry little squirrel.